well, milk price is low. I got to make up for that by milking more cows. I don't think that is the answer. I think we want to overstock less rather than more. Well, milk prices drop.
Welcome to Rumination, the podcast that offers practical solutions to the challenges and opportunities in our industry. Our topic today is optimizing stocking density, balancing herd profitability, and individual cow productivity and longevity. Hi, this is Gwyn, and today I'm honored to have Dr. Albert de Vries of the University of Florida joining us. A few introductory notes about our guest today. Dr. de Vries grew up on a dairy farm in the Netherlands. He completed his BSc and MS at the University of Wageningen in Holland and a PhD at the University of Minnesota. His interests are in the optimization of culling and replacement strategies, statistical process control, economics of reproduction, and precision dairy farming. He writes and teaches about valuing decision alternatives on dairy farms with a focus on cattle replacement, reproduction, and genetics. And part of the effort is also making decision support aids available to the public. He works with dairy farmers and allied industries in those initiatives. And in return, he also works in extension, which allows him to focus questions that are important to the dairy industry in his research programs. Dr. de Vries also teaches 2 undergraduate dairy courses and advises undergraduate dairy students and graduate students. The topic of optimizing and understanding stocking density is today's topic and touches on past research and presentations that Dr. de Vries has led. So thank you, Dr. de Vries, for joining us today on Rumination.
Thank you, Chris, and I'm happy to be here and tell you what I know about stocking density.
We look forward to it. It seems that hitting on an ideal stocking density is a question that often has a challenging answer. It's complex, right? There's many variables that come into play where the economics of overlaps with practical operations on the dairy and perhaps the risk of adding additional stressors to the herd. I'd like to know a little bit more of why you became interested in researching this topic in particular.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I actually had an intern student from the Netherlands who wanted to spend some time with me. And that student was very interested in welfare. And I said, well, if we just do welfare in the US, maybe that's not of primary interest to producers, although I understand our producers are all interested in welfare aspects as well. But I'd like to put dollars to whatever we do with cows. And so we did a little digging and came up on the topic of stocking density. Economics of stocking density, and it's really a fascinating topic because there's some welfare implications, but there are clearly also economic implications. And as you alluded to, there's very many factors, and there honestly really isn't a single one best answer to give. But there are some important principles that we can discuss today.
Yeah, and I think it's those principles we want to dig down into because you're absolutely right. There's no one answer for all farms. So on those principles, or what we might call key influencers, what are the key influencers of the economic return when you're evaluating, or a farm is evaluating their optimal stocking density?
Yeah, I think we should start with defining what do we mean by stocking density. All right, and there are different metrics of that. I mean, I think, we're not talking about dry lots here. We're talking about free stalls. We were also not interested in fresh cows or dry cows, which I think all experts agree should not be overstocked. We're looking at lactating cows, and we also did not think that feed bunk space was a limiting factor. So in our research, we really looked at number of cows over the number of stalls in a pen. And if that is 100%, then you got 1 stall per cow. And if it's like 120%, you have 120 cows for 100 stalls. So that is where we sort of limited our research to. And secondly, I think it's important to get the economic principle right. What are we trying to optimize here when we're talking about economics, okay? And the criteria here is not profitability per cow, because cow is not a limiting factor. It is the number of stalls in the pen that is the limiting factor. And then it's up to us as consultants, as producers, to figure out, well, how can I essentially be the most profitable and how many cows does it take in that pen? And so how do you then determine what is the optimal number of cows in that pen where the number of stalls is a fixed number essentially, right? And the economic principle here is that we want to essentially add cows, one more cow all the time, and that is basically a marginal cow. And that cow adds milk income to the pen, but there's some feed cost. But at the same time, the cow affects the other cows in the pen. These other cows in the pen, essentially, if we're starting to overstock, are a little less happy, right? Because maybe they have a little less opportunity of time to lay down, for example. There's a little bit more competition in that pen. So these other cows are starting perhaps to produce a little less milk, for example, right? And so the economic principle is, does adding one more cow or two more cows add more profit to that pen than the profit we take away with all the other cows already in the pen? And at some point, you can keep adding cows, and the marginal revenue is greater than the marginal cost, the losses on the other side. But you're hitting a plateau at some point. That if you add one more cow to it, actually that one cow is a profitable cow because a lot of her fixed costs already paid for. Labor may not change, the tractor drives at the same time, but all the other cows in the pen are producing a little less, and what they lose is more than what the one cow adds. And so then we're over the peak of optimal stocking density, right? And so an economist would look at this and says, well, we're reaching the optimal stocking density where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. But I think the easiest way to think about it, adding one cow at a time, and does she add more to the profit of the pen than we take away from the other cows at the pen?
So interesting to you we prepared this question, and when thinking about they were mature cows, right? In lactation, do you want to hypothesize about first lactation animals or?
Yeah, first lactation for the older cows. I think in our research we did not look into this, but going back to the economic principles I just explained, well, what does it's not too difficult to say, okay, what is a milk production of a cow? What happens when we add a cow to a pen? First lactation is different than an older cow, but we just even did not distinguish between different lactation numbers, like should you overcrowd maybe more mature cows versus first lactation cows? It's actually a very good question. And so we know what a cow, how much milk she produces. We know what she eats. So we calculate some income of feed cost. The hard part is really figuring out what we lose on the cows already in the pen. Okay, if we add them into it. And for example, there's less laying time, right? A little bit more competition. And so we had to look into the literature, and clearly one of the first things you get into when you read about effects of stocking density on cows is, well, they lay down a little less, okay? And I think if we... and so there too, the science is not all that similar and conclusive about how much cows lose when you add to them. But we looked at quite a few studies, and we found, for example, on average, that if we increase stocking density by 10 percentage points, say from 100% to 110%, cows lay down about 20 minutes less per day. Okay, and so if you went from 110 to 120, does that mean they lose 40 minutes per day? Okay, there's some studies then that also equate the amount of laying down time with milk production, and a few other studies. And so I think we found that if we increase stocking density by 10 percentage points, again, from 100 to 110 or from 110 to 120, cows lose about 1.5 pounds of milk per day. Okay, and so that is the cows that feel overstocked, says, I'm less happy, I'm going to produce that less, right? But there we sort of identified in our math or in our analysis some weakness that the literature is not very conclusive about that. And one of the reasons is that the folks that have studied how cows react to stocking density often do short-term experiments. Like we do this for 3 weeks, 4 weeks, And we don't quite know if we overstock cows for longer periods, whether there's longer effects of that, or as soon as you reduce the overstocking, they're back to their unoverstocked, essentially, level of milk production. So even on the milk production part, which is really the main driver of the stocking economics question, a lot of questions out there. We also looked at some other factors as well, like what is the effect on fertility, for example, or on culling. And even there's a little less conclusive evidence. Fertility decreases a little bit, reproductive performance, if you have a breeding pen and you overstock. On culling, we didn't find anything, but what we hear from producers is that, well, there's more injuries if you overstock pens. Okay, so that probably leads to a little bit more culling. Those injuries should affect also milk production, so maybe we've already accounted for that. So again, we were interested in one, the economic principle, and then being able to model and ask some what if questions. What if milk production changes by 1 pound per 10% or 2 pounds per 10%? And then obviously prices have an effect on what is the optimal there as well.
And in that study, you looked at milk production. Did you look at component yield? And how could that differ possibly?
I think we looked at component yield, but I don't remember we saw anything necessarily, right? Because of course we get paid for components. I don't think it was very clear that either fat or protein, for example, was reduced by overstocking.
And you want to hypothesize on the fact is if you didn't, because you maintained eating space per animal with increased stocking density, is that what typically might happen on a dairy farm, or would they be limiting eating space and how that might impact the economics?
Yeah, that's correct, right? So obviously, if you went from lots of eating space, like in a 4-0 barn where you have enough space, per stall, and you overstock a little bit, I don't think eating space is affected much. But maybe, if you went from 20% overstocking to 30%, eating space may be affected. However, I think if eating space is affected, that probably is then observed in cows producing less milk, right? And so the amount how much the cows eat gets, you see that in the milk production. I want to make another observation that when we put this analysis together, we did not find anything else other than saying the response to overstocking is linear. By that I mean by that say we lose a pound per cow and we go from 100% to 110%, we lose a pound per cow. If we went from 100% to 120%, we lose 2 pounds per cow. If we went from 100 to 130%, we lose 3 pounds per cow. So it's sort of a linear decrease. I think that's probably questionable. Probably if we get over the hump, we get into 30%, 40%, the cows are so much less happy or they eat less that maybe they start to produce less, right, than the 1 pound loss that I have per 10%. Sort of a decreasing return instead of a linear response to overstocking. Again, this is where the literature, the science was not very conclusive, and we really didn't have any good access to on-farm data too, where people really practiced a varied stocking density and saw what happened to the bulk tank, for example, because obviously that'd be another useful source to put in the modeling.
So thank you for that. I think we've kind of talked about the pros and cons, but if there are some others that you wanted to that you haven't talked about, want to highlight, we can do that. But we also wanted to talk about some of the management strategies that you've seen that farmers can do to mitigate some of these losses as stocking density might increase in lactating groups.
Yeah. All right. So I haven't really said much about welfare yet. I mean, the student I work with was really interested in that, and I think it needs to be on our minds too, right? So if we say we just want to take care of the cow, we probably don't want to overstock, right? We're probably compromising welfare perhaps a tiny bit only, right? If we start to overstock, and more when we overstock more. So we don't know how to square that with profitability, but obviously that needs to be in our mind as well, right? And that is just cows, don't have the space to lay down when they want to, for example. When it comes to the pros and cons, when we build a spreadsheet, and I will tell you later what the access to the spreadsheet is, that actually income over feed cost drives optimal stocking density. And so milk price has a big effect, and feed cost too, on what optimal stocking density is. In fact, if milk price is high, economically, you can really overstock quite a bit, a lot actually. We did not go past 50% more overstocking, which is already sort of very high, but in not unreasonable cases, we found that'd be optimal to do. Really overstock, especially when milk price is high. You overstock more cows in the pen, right? And so the reverse is true too, that if my milk price decreases, that means my additional milk is not worth as much. That means my one cow that I add to it is not producing enough milk to sort of pay for the loss of all these cows. So if I have low milk prices, I want to overstock less. And I think that is maybe counterintuitive what a lot of producers do. They said, well, milk price is low. I got to make up for that by milking more cows. I don't think that is the answer. I think we want to overstock less rather than more while milk prices drop.
Can I ask a further question about that? Because I'm not an economist, but where does cash flow come in? If a farm is needing to increase cash flow, does that kind of go against optimal stocking density and low milk pricing?
Yeah, I think you're on the right track there, because we assume our fixed costs are independent of the number of cows. So we would add cows to it up to the point of maximum optimal stocking density, which implies that is for that pen the highest cash flow. And so with low milk prices, we reduce cow numbers, because if we don't, our cash flow is going to be even less. So cash flows in this analysis, and this is obviously what I call like a steady state, right? We sort of permanently are at a high or at a low level of stocking density. But it's the same thing. So the question becomes practically different. Well, my milk prices change, and I may or may not have the cows. What is the long-term response to stocking density? Those are harder to answer, because again, we don't know the long-term response to stocking density per se. But essentially, yeah, when we optimize our stocking density here, we're optimizing the cash flow, the amount of cash made there for that pen on that day over time.
Okay, thank you. So, other strategies that you've seen producers, or you would hypothesize producers could utilize to minimize the individual cow losses in an overstocked scenario?
Yeah, so you minimize individual cow losses by not overstocking, right? So but saying I'm overstocking X percent, how would I then reduce the losses on these cows? I don't have a long list. I can imagine that at least it needs to be attractive for these cows to lay down when they can, right? That means all the stalls are well groomed and functional and not broken. And I think all the listeners to the podcast probably know this. So, probably heat abatement, I can imagine, needs to be in order. Living in my state of Florida, that's a big deal, obviously. So probably comes down to cow care, is taking care of that aspect as well as possible. Allows us to overstock probably a little more than when we don't take care of those basic management principles of cow care.
No, I think those are good points, because I think it's important to reflect that if this approach is what we're doing and need to, and it makes sense, we just got to make sure that increase our individual cow care to maximize even further the output from that pen, right?
Yeah,
That
right.
maybe you're going to be in the lower portion of the individual cow losses. So thank you for those points and for the discussion on the cash output per pen. And it sounds like you just need to do your math before just jumping into these scenarios. You need to understand your farm situation and do the calculations on expected.
You need to do your math. I remember when I first talked about this, I got some emails from producers that said, "Wow, I actually overstocked," and at that point, they learned they could overstock more than what they have been thinking. I think I've also seen people say, "Well, just monitor bulk tank milk, right? If you reduce cows, your bulk tank milk goes up. It means you clearly were overstocked, right? Because you also have to pay, for the cost of maintaining the cows, feed, cow replacement, and so on."
No, so thank you for that. So as we wind up, I always like to ask, what are some of the key take-home points for producers and nutritionists and lenders, in fact, and veterinarians when considering evaluating the impact of a stocking density on the farms they work with? What would you recommend they look at?
Yeah, if I put on my economics glasses, if you will, that I think overstocking a pace, and like last year in the US, we had actually good milk prices. I mean, I think those folks that were able to have more cows in the barn probably made quite a little bit of money out of that. At the same time, we learned through the research that it sort of is farm dependent in terms of prices and what is the losses that you observe. And so we have a spreadsheet available for listeners that they can work with, play with. Probably the easiest way to get there, if you go to Google and you look for dairy stocking density calculator Florida, I think we end up number one on the Google search list there. And there's an EDIS extension publication there. And there, in that publication, it lays out what the research was about, hopefully in not too scientific terms. And there's a link to a calculator we used as well that we made available for folks to play with. And the feedback that I've had, that the folks that work with the calculator thought it was useful. You can play with, what if my cows lose 1 pound or 2 pounds? What happens when my milk prices change and so on? What if my feed costs change? Give you some idea of, where your optimal stocking density ends. And so one thing is, we're talking about optimal stocking density, but really we also are interested in, well, what if I'm not optimal? What am I losing if I'm not optimal, right? We can get very hung up on 20% overstocking density is the optimal. But if my loss compared to 10% overstocking is very minor, then I may not want to see them. For practical reasons, there's not a lot to be gained to overstock more, to get to the optimal. It's always compared to one if it's not optimal. And this calculator that I mentioned shows a nice curve, not only what is optimal, but also if I'm not quite optimal, what is then my losses per stall per day, such that sometimes these differences are so minor, you say, well, I don't really have to worry too much about the optimal because I'm sort of in the ballpark anyway.
Wonderful. Could you remind us of how to find that website?
Yeah, so I think I suggest you go to Google, you search for dairy stocking density calculator and put Florida in there as well. And that gets you to an extension publication from the University of Florida. I think it's called Economics Evaluation of Stall Stocking Density. And that has that link to that spreadsheet in it.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. And thank you, Dr. Vries, for joining us today on Rumination and for sharing your wealth of experience and knowledge. And if the audience would like to learn more, again, follow Dr. De Vries' advice to locate the document, and we will publish it as well on our Rumination podcast website. So thank you very much, Dr. De Vries, for joining us.
Yeah, thank you very much. It was my pleasure to talk about one of my favorite topics, actually, stocking density. It's sort of quite a fascinating thing to figure out in our industry. Thank you very much.
And I also want to thank the audience, of course, for listening to us today. And so that you don't miss our next episode or past episodes of Jeff O. Rumination Podcast, you can find us at Apple and Google Podcasts as well as Spotify. And this podcast was brought to you by Jeff O. Nutrition, precision nutrition for a growing world. and have a great day.